Good afternoon. Welcome to the joint event for the American Enterprise Institute and Business Executives for National Security on the economic and security consequences of great power competition with China. My name is Mackenzie Eaglen. I'm a fellow at AEI, and it's my great pleasure to welcome this panel this morning and introduce our moderator, General Joseph Votel. He started running BENS, as it's commonly affectionately referred to, in 2020. But before that, all of us have followed his storied military career spanning nearly 4 decades, with his most recent job as commander of U.S. Central Command. I have a nickname for General Votel. I'll tell him in the chat afterwards that we won't share today. And so where he oversaw tremendous gains against ISIS and the Salafi Jihadi movement in his job. He's received numerous awards, held numerous commands. I won't go through them all. He's on numerous boards. He's quite an impressive scholar and soldier, and now statesman running the Business Executive for National Security. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy, and we stand all in his long shadow, and we'll try to sound as smart as he does this morning. General Votel, thank you for having us as part of your event today.
Thanks, Mackenzie. It's great to be with you, and a special thanks to the American Enterprise Institute and the wonderful staff there for hosting this event today. At Business Executives for National Security, a dedicated group of our members, many of whom are among the nation's most prominent and innovative private sector leaders, have been actively examining geostrategic competition. And we believe that today's important discussion is not only an extension of those efforts, but also critical to identifying the solutions needed to safeguard our interests at home and abroad. As many of you know, the National Defense Strategy, which was released just a couple months ago, reaffirmed that outpacing China remains an economic and security priority for the nation. In bringing together our two great organizations with our broad set of policy and business leaders affords us an incredible opportunity to exchange ideas and perspectives this morning. Insights and strategies that I think will make us all more prepared to shepherd our businesses and institutions moving forward. Joining me on the screen are 3 of the nation's foremost experts at the intersection of commercial enterprise and national defense. And I can think of few others more suited to offer insights on geostrategic competition for this particular audience than today's panelist. Mackenzie Eaglen is a senior fellow at AEI, specializing in military strategies, budgets, and readiness. While Derek Scissors, also a senior fellow at AEI, focuses on U.S.-Asian economic issues. And Anthony Vinci is one of BEN's very own, serving as the vice chair of the BEN's Competitiveness Council, while also managing a private equity fund focused on technology and supply chain investments. Thanks to all 3 of you for joining me today. It's great to see you. For our audience, I'll get us started and then go to some of your questions towards the latter half of the hour. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time via Twitter at hashtag AEI &BENS, BENS on Twitter, and James just put up the Twitter handle right there. So please don't hesitate to put your questions in at any particular point. So let's go ahead and get started. And I want to start off with a question for all 3 of you, and we can answer in the order in which I introduce you. So Mackenzie, then Derek, then Anthony. But here's the question. Probably top of mind for many is that recent reports now indicate that the Chinese economy is experiencing a serious slowdown in the wake of their zero COVID strategy and other events that are taking place in that nation. With that as a backdrop, how do you view the current state of global competition today versus 2 years ago? And how do you believe that it will shift our or China's approach to geostrategic competition in the years ahead? Mackenzie, let's go to you first.
Great. Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm worried. I'm going to let Derek cover the waterfront on China's economy, and he'll do it quite well. But I get nervous when economies start to slip and leaders feel like their power might be at risk or threatened somehow. So that's sort of point one, but I'm going to stick to what I know, which is not that, and which is the sort of balance of power. And it's shifting dramatically, I think, in China's favor and in the security realm. And this isn't, Mackenzie's opinion. I look across the internal U.S. government reports like the Pentagon's China report. I look to quasi-government agencies and entities like Congressional Research Service, look to outside organizations and FFRDCs, and when you sort of scan all of the research, there's reason to be concerned. It's not just China's significant military quantitative growth, but it's also its qualitative advantages. They are matching or surpassing ours, not in every way, but in a lot of ways. And so for our event, I wanted to just kind of go through, I pulled up a few sort of hot take examples. And of course, individually, some of these might not matter, but the trend lines are what I'm really worried about here, broadly speaking, even with the COVID disruption. So we know that China already has the world's largest army, navy, coast guard, maritime militia, and sub-strategic missile force. We know they're quadrupling their nuclear stockpile right now. Their hypersonic capabilities are pretty advanced. And then over this time that this has all been happening, really concentrated in the last decade in particular, what we've seen is Beijing's growing less restrained in its actions at home and abroad as they become more militarily capable. And my final point on this isn't not just what they are fielding and doing, and of course doing in their neighborhood, but also globally with their now power projection navy, but also kind of their investments, right? So just looking at what they can spend and what they can afford, just like our own GDP is a measurement of that. The growth of China's military budget has consistently outpaced its overall economic growth for the last decade. I think that trend will continue. I leave that to Derek to talk about how able they are to do that, but that's also concerning me because in the US, we've seen the opposite trend for our defense investments relative to what we can afford.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Derek, over to you.
On the econ side, global economic competition doesn't shift meaningfully in 2 years unless there's a war that destroys one of the top competitors. Otherwise, fundamentals just don't change that fast. One thing that can occur in 2 years, say, is rising suspicion. For example, China is still the world's premier exporter, despite a series of policies harming the private sector for political reasons. Its competitiveness has not shifted in the 2-year period, but it has caused many firms, foreign and Chinese, to wonder if these policies will continue, with an eye on alternatives if they do continue, and some firms have better alternatives than others. If you had a credit agency that was willing to tell the truth about China, which we do not have anywhere, it would still give China the highest competitiveness grade on the export side, for example, but it would also put it on a watch list for a drop because of that policy uncertainty, zero COVID, but it also started before then with Xi Jinping attacking the private sector. If you look toward the end of the decade, Chinese competitiveness will unavoidably drop due to deteriorating demographics. I can say a lot more about this if the audience wants. I'd rather jump to the implications for the U.S., but if you disagree with me, please push me. The important thing for the U.S. is always to take care of our own house. One thing everyone who is not a sitting politician should agree on: if you're borrowing lots of money indefinitely, you've done something wrong. Both the U.S. and China qualify for this. We're very aware of our own situation. China's debt accumulation situation from 2009 to 2021 is actually considerably worse than ours. Another sign that their competitiveness is unsustainable. Then we have to get to a question that Mackenzie brought up, which is a China that is struggling right now and may do better in the next few years, but again will be struggling by about 2030, could be a little earlier. No matter what it says, it'll be saying everything's fine, but it will still be struggling. Is that struggling China less dangerous or more? Under a different Chinese leadership, I would probably say less. But under a cult of personality dictatorship as established by Xi Jinping, I think the clear answer, as Mackenzie indicated, is that they are more dangerous. Among other things, supply chains running through the PRC and serving the United States are now a point of vulnerability that we have to address as part of the competition. If not, it doesn't mean we lose the competition. There are a lot of dimensions. Mackenzie just brought up the military dimension. But if we don't address those supply chains, for sure we are going to suffer because Xi Jinping is not going to go quietly into the good night. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Derek. Anthony?
Thanks, and thanks for having me today. I agree fully with Mackenzie and Derek on the points they were bringing up. An additional point I would bring into the conversation is one interesting factor here is that China has rode a wave of capitalism or quasi-capitalism to get where it is today over the last 20 years. And that's worked out obviously very well for them, taking billions of people or hundreds of millions of people, out of poverty, grown several very significant industries to become world class. But there's a downside to that capitalist system, which is there are these oscillations, there are these ups and downs, and recessions happen. And it's not clear to me how China, the Chinese government, the Chinese people are going to react when one of those recessions occurs, which it sounds like they are heading towards or may already be in, whether or not they admit it and whether or not they release data showing that. And on the other hand, in the US, we are accustomed to those recessions. And they happen about once a decade. In this case, a little over a decade. And our society, our political institutions, our economic system is pretty prepared for them. And we have more or less standardized ways of getting through them. And that's part of the system. Whereas in China, it's not clear that they have that resiliency yet. That could lead to a couple of scenarios. They could build up that resiliency and potentially come up with the right moves. They might not. It might be a rocky time, which I suspect it will be, and that could lead to the kind of instability I think Mackenzie was referencing. There is a covenant between the people and the government, and though they may not be elected per se, the covenant sort of says if you do well to us, we'll let you kind of keep being there. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. I think it's going to be a very concerning time for Xi and everyone else there. And I would be on the lookout for how they do as a nation, as a government, as an economic system, begin to adapt to this recession cycle, and look at the specific policies they put in place and see if we think those policies are going to work, and how fast they, when they inevitably find that those policies don't always necessarily work, upon first contact with the enemy, how fast they're able to shift those policies in order to find something that will work.
Thanks, Anthony. So just a quick follow-up question here, maybe Derek for you, and then others can jump in. So just so I'm clear, does China have awareness of their economic situation that they're heading towards? Do the leaders understand that?
They do, at least to some extent. I mean, all of us have our biases about how we see the economy, including American leadership. The Chinese leadership certainly has that as well. I'll give you an example of where they're aware. In response to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, China borrowed an absurd amount of money, wasted most of it, got itself onto a debt track which limited its long-term economic growth potential. And in response to COVID, they haven't done that because they've learned the lesson and they've been very explicit about it, saying, we don't want to do this again. It was a mistake last time, which I find amusing because a lot of people on the street where AI is located thought it was a great idea, but it wasn't. And the Chinese have learned that. On the flip side, it's not clear that Xi Jinping, for example, understands fully the trade-off he's engaged in. He values political control, obviously, over economic results, no question. That's his choice. That's not being delusional. That's what he values. So he attacks the private sector repeatedly before COVID, in a variety of ways. And he knows there's some economic cost, but so that's not delusion. Well, the delusion may be that he can just order the results he wants. Like, I want technological advance. We will spend a lot of money. Therefore, we will get technological advance, because competition is not really part of that. Competition doesn't drive innovation. Government orders and spending drive innovation. So, there's an understanding of the weaknesses of their system. They know the demographic blow is coming. They know they borrowed too much money. It's not a complete understanding. There's a blind spot about the abilities of the state.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's, Mackenzie, question for you here, and we'll take this a little bit further here. So as integrated deterrence and focus on innovation grows following the release of the U.S. National Defense Strategy, how do you foresee the greater integration of the commercial sector into our overall defense posture?
So, the last Defense Strategy Commission thought a lot about this. The term, in many ways, I know this secretary thinks of integrated deterrence in sort of 3 levels, right? So it's within the Department of Defense, between and among the services and stakeholders, within the U.S. government, within and across the U.S. government, and then with the U.S. and our allies and partners. And I think that's all great and very hopeful, although a bit broad. Maybe too broad. In fact, it might turn out. But in previous administrations, the first and the second part of this secretary's vision were called whole of government. And I bring it up because, as Derek was just alluding to, I guess, it's called sort of this military industrial fusion effort that China has, that we don't really, we don't have that kind of industrial policy for good and bad reasons here in the US. And so the result is, it's just really, in fact, what Derek was saying, it is just based on pure investment by the government, which helps spur interest. The volume and number and scope of contracts and awards helps spur interest and innovation separately by those big and small firms, new entrants and legacy companies playing in this space. And so what we have seen by the Defense Department is, for 7 straight years, an overemphasis, a bias towards research and development, and at the expense of procurement. Well, research, that's useful to some extent, but I would argue 7 years is too long, right? It began as what then Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work called the third offset strategy. He largely concluded that this had been a success, let the 1,000 flowers bloom approach. But yet the department continues to, sort of bumble on with this bumper sticker strategy of record R&D. There is some innovation that certainly happens to that, but without shifting things into procurement and fielding them at scale, those are roads to innovation nowhere. And what we're seeing the department doing, again, is bias the future at the expense of the present. China's not doing that. They're doing both, actually. And when I think about, just their shipbuilding, I was doing a little planning ahead of time, looking at some of their industries, and the Chinese shipbuilding industry, they, as I mentioned earlier, they're obviously quantitatively ahead, but Chinese government, they help their military efforts with commercial shipbuilding as well. And obviously America doesn't agree with that approach. We don't believe in subsidies to prop up small businesses, but nonetheless, they're cranking out volume. And when I'll give you one quick anecdote before I wrap it up. When staffers on the Hill went to the Department of the Navy this year and said, hey, look, there's money, there's willpower, and there's intent by Congress to ramp up our shipbuilding. We're worried about the PLAN. We're worried about a lot of, negative trends that the U.S. Navy's been shrinking steadily for decades. And the Navy said, basically, we cannot accept your money. We cannot build 3 destroyers next year, even if you give it to us free and clear. And nor can we get to 3 submarines a year. Why? Because it takes time and planning, right? It's a 3 to 5 year effort, not just the long lead time for procurement of certain supplies and metals, but the specialty, the training, the apprenticeship, the labor, the actual facilities. That's a really disturbing fact. And it was also knowable. This was something that the Navy should have been prepped for, to have the equivalent of shovel-ready jobs a long time ago.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's great. Anthony, I want to come to. Well, actually, let me go to Derek first, and I'll come to Anthony. So, Derek, Congress is in the process of negotiating a bipartisan competition bill that could have long-ranging effects, from boosting semiconductor production to screening outbound investment, all with the aim to keep our edge against China. How do you view this bill, and does it meet? Do you think it can meet its intended goal? And is there more that needs to be done? And are there some parts of this that give you some concern?
Okay, so the first thing is the broad bill is not going to pass. We're at June, we're a month away from recess. Congress always comes back from recess angry at China because, as I said, when you're an incumbent, you have to blame someone. And when you blame Belgium, it doesn't satisfy your constituents that much. You're not going to pass this in September for a million reasons. You have a month left. They've made almost no progress in terms of making the decisions necessary. What they can strip out is the research spending, which was Senator Schumer's original proposal, subsidies for semiconductor production here, which seemingly every member of Congress likes, and I don't, and some bone to throw House Democrats because they don't really care that much. House Democratic leadership does not care that much about a China bill. And for evidence, you can see the China bill that they wrote, which is 2,300 pages not about China and about 600 sort of about China. The bills as they stand are failures, and I'm glad that they're going to die probably. What we had was a standard situation in Congress where there was a rallying point, let's do something about China, and that just got washed away by everything else. A bunch of findings, a bunch of pronouncements, not action. I'm blaming Congress here, but you could throw the last couple administrations in here too. They've done something similar. With regard to the components that could get passed, I'll take the one that I like best in theory. Screening outbound investment. We currently review Chinese investment in the U.S. to make sure it doesn't acquire sensitive technology. That's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. We have export controls, which are supposed to prevent the transfer of technology to China and other countries, although the Department of Commerce has disregarded the Congress and refused to implement these controls properly. We have no restriction at all on American money supporting the development of the same technology in China. Let's think about that for a second. You can't buy it. We're not supposed to give it to you, but we'll give you money to develop it, which is the worst possible outcome since it boosts Chinese capabilities the most. Industry's response to this is basically to lie, to make absurdly false claims about how the U.S. never does this. I can go into detail. That hasn't been true for the bulk of American history. The U.S. has restricted outbound investment, certainly to our adversaries. The Senate won't pass this because a handful of Republican senators on key committees are acting on behalf of the financial community. And the Biden administration has repeatedly brought up outbound investment review, but done nothing. I don't know how many times you can bring it up and say this is a good idea and take no action. So there's a useful thing that could be done in these bills. It's not being done. The broad bills will not pass. There are segments that are going to pass, and those segments really depend on how they're written. If we're going to give money out, you shouldn't be allowed to cooperate freely with China, but I'm afraid that might be the outcome.
Well, what's it going to take to build some unity in Congress?
That is an unfortunately good question. I wish it was a terrible question with an obvious answer, but it's not. I don't think the Congress as a whole, there are certain members, absolutely, Republican and Democrat, Senate and House, who are exceptions to this, and there are a number of them, but I don't think the Congress as a whole takes China seriously, and neither does the Biden administration. And the way to see that is there's a lot of talk, but anytime something happens, domestic or foreign, China gets dropped. And all these things seem sort of reasonable. Oh, well, I mean, look, Afghanistan, Ukraine, domestic events, which I don't want to touch on because they're very controversial. That's all fine, but that's telling us that Congress doesn't really care about China. So the unity is at the level of talk. And when it comes to action, something else is always more important. I'm afraid the only thing that's going to unify us is being frightened. We're not frightened enough yet. And when that happens, Congress will unify.
Okay, thanks. That's not very satisfying, but thank you for that. So, Anthony, you and our fellow Benz members of the Competitiveness Council released a primer at the end of last year that outlined the many strategies and economic tools that the Chinese Communist Party employ to help outpace the United States. Do you believe China's slowdown will force Xi and the Communist Party to pull back on some of these strategies, like the Made in China 2025 approach, or embolden them to double down? Derek, you may have a
Yeah.
comment as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that primer, was primarily targeted at supporting American businesses in what we thought would be a moderate way to minimize and mitigate some of the risks of inherent in doing business in China, such as IP theft, for example, um, and try to strike that balance between supporting your business. You have to run your business. You have fiduciary responsibility and so forth, but also supporting America as a nation and in a strategic national security way. So we tried to strike that balance in that primer. Since we wrote it, with the economic turn in China and here, I do suspect, my intuition is that China will continue on the path it's on, for the programs that it's set up, such as the Made in China 2025, or the Belt and Road Initiative, just in the sense that those plans take years to put together, and they're generally allowed to run their course. Now, the question is, will the planning process now, under the current conditions, lead to changes in what will be the subsequent plans? And I suspect that they will. And one example that I would put out there is the US has begun to move a notch faster in terms of creating supply chain resiliency since COVID. Not as fast as I would like, and I suspect many in the national security community would like, but it has become a significant topic of discussion. I see it every day as an investor. Companies are going out there and trying to figure out, especially in the technology industry, trying to figure out how they can kind of have a more resilient supply chain, or companies are raising money to develop business plans that feed into supply chain resiliency. And a lot of that is supported by some US government programs, for example, in mining, batteries, and so forth, that incentivizes doing so. And China's obviously going to have to respond to that in its programs and have a different plan. I suspect it still has the same strategic goals, but it may just have to have a different tactical plan. I do think for our primer, if we were to rewrite it again today, we would say effectively the same things, the same defenses against Chinese infringement on companies, but might push even more forcefully for supply chain resiliency, and suggest that as companies are adapting to our recession, which I think we are likely heading towards, if not already in, that they use that as an opportunity to invest internally, and within the US, onshoring or friendshoring, as some people refer to it as, with allied countries, rather than turning to China for that kind of supply chain resiliency over the next few years.
Thanks. Derek, anything to add there?
Yeah, really quickly, building off what Anthony said, and maybe disagreeing a little. There are going to be necessities and luxuries as China faces increasing constraints, whether you think the constraints are this year or 5 years from now or whatever. They're coming. Chinese growth is slow. The demographics are going to assure these constraints come. I happen to think the Belt and Road is more of a luxury. Not that the program will disappear; it certainly won't. But the resources allocated to it have already started shrinking, and I don't think they will be reconstituted. What is a necessity? We can reasonably disagree on that. What I think is absolutely true, again, building off what Anthony said, but making more explicit, technology is a necessity. Everything you see the Chinese doing and trying to develop technological capabilities stealing, investing, cooperating, you name it, internal security, external security, their economic development, all of that is going to be a necessity. Whatever resources have to be taken away from, they'll be taken away from. The tactics may change, that's for sure. They set up these investment research funds by the state. Maybe that's not a great tactic, but for sure, we're not going to see them move off their technological advancement goals.
Great, thanks. So a question for all of you, and we'll start with Mackenzie here, is Beijing views their military-civil fusion, which we've touched on briefly here, and centralized industrial policy as fundamental to their ambitions. Should the U.S. adopt similar strategies in our own attempts to stay competitive?
Yeah, so typically, I don't like Soviet style, central management and planning, and yet that is what our Defense Department does to procure items. It's sort of the last bastion of that in America, and yet the trend lines are so worrisome that I'm open to really anything at this point. Anything that advances, that brings tangible advancements in acquiring and fielding and demonstrating combat power, American combat power, because that's all about deterrence. And deterrence is how we win the competition, because if we lose the competition, we're going to war. I mean, unfortunately, it's kind of simple. So what I was referencing earlier, I finally pulled up the article from Maritime Executive, and basically, China's sea power buildup with its 3C services here, it's unprecedented in recent history. They have the world's largest shipbuilding industry, and they don't just fund the facilities. They fund all the other things that I mentioned that we need, so that if we were going to ramp up our own shipbuilding, whether that's undersea or surface forces. So they fund facilities, training for employees, they rotate workers, and their commercial shipbuilding industry subsidizes and supports their military shipbuilding industry. And so what the way it was characterized was that China's combining authoritarianism and economic dynamism in a new way. Now, I get it. The dynamism is a question mark, according to Derek and Anthony, and I agree with that. But nonetheless, I think their preference to still prioritize military spending will continue. So what do I mean, not just industrial policy, because policy is really just words on paper until you do something about it. I want money to flow to these efforts. So I was marveling at a recent Pentagon report on competition, lamenting the rapid decline in suppliers and vendors and companies that do business, again, big to small, with the Defense Department. I mean, it's almost a collapse. And that corresponds with the Budget Control Act era. Now, that doesn't mean in real terms we're not spending a whole lot of money on the military. We are, but most of that money is fenced and fixed for sort of autopilot, sort of keeping the lights on, paying people, paying benefits and operations and maintenance. It's not going towards innovation, investments, and procurement. And so I'll give you another anecdote. In a recent meeting, Pentagon leaders had with industry executives, the question we all, everyone's familiar. I mean, I know General Votel, you would have known this before, but the rest of the world became familiar with Stingers and Javelins and their utility on the battlefield in Ukraine. And of course, we haven't built those in years. And, we're sending some of our own stockpile, we're depleting some of it. And of course, the Pentagon leaders are worried, and Congress is more worried, I'd argue, than Pentagon leaders, about how to replenish our stockpiles. So there was a meeting with industry execs, and it came up, well, what do we need to do to sort of get things going again? And the answer was money, contracts. You have to actually put things under contract, make awards, and then CEOs can go raise money against a guaranteed funding stream. This is like Econ 101 stuff. I don't know why industry execs had to tell Pentagon leadership that, but they did. So I'll believe people when the dollars flow, not what the industrial policy on paper says.
Great, thank you very much. Really, really well made argument there. Anthony, what do you think? Time for a U.S. industrial policy?
Well, it wouldn't be our first time. During and after World War II and into the beginning of the Cold War, we created a system for the military to work with an industrial base in an entirely new way. Really the rise of prime contractors and associated organizations to support that, like FFRDCs. And then over time, we adjusted it created the FAR and so forth. That was all targeted at a certain type of competition. And now we're in a new type of competition. We're attempting to apply that same system. It's clearly not working. And I think the biggest area it's not working was already brought up, which is the valley of death, as it's called, between small tech programs and getting into big programs of record. And that has to do with the way there's colors of money in the budget, and a stark separation between what's called RDT&E, or early stage research and development, and test and evaluation, and effectively technology development, and then O&M, the operations and maintenance. And we don't have a good way to connect those things, and we're in a competition that requires much faster technology development and fielding. And that's the key missing piece. I don't think that's industrial policy to suggest that we need a system to more rapidly field systems. I think that's just a policy modification in effect. And sometimes I worry that when we use that phrase industrial policy, it sort of misconstrues what the real situation is. We've always had some form of policy and law around how the government designs, develops, and fields technologies. We're just now need a modification of that policy to do that, and that modification does not equal communism. And I don't think anyone is suggesting that. And I think what's happening now is there are several programs in place that are, to some degree experimental and trying to figure out how to solve this problem. But ultimately Congress is going to have to pick one and run with it. And I know several people, some of whom personally, who have specific proposals in mind. That there's not a lack of proposals out there. We just need to pick the best one and kind of run with it, so we can start to field these new technologies quickly. But I would kind of also at the same time echo what Mackenzie is saying, which is you also just need to put money into the system. If you want to have more modern weapons, you should go buy more modern weapons and put program money in the system to do that, rather than putting that money at old systems, which I think most people would agree we don't necessarily need. And if we want to have more ships, we have all the policy we need to buy more ships, notwithstanding the comment that there's a lead time on them. But if we wanted to ramp up our shipping industry, we could. That's just additional budget. But maybe combining these two things, additional money at systems that we need, and a better system of getting from early stage tech to the program in kind of rapid fielding capabilities, could actually shrink the amount of money necessary that you would have to add into the system. Because a lot of the technologies that I see, at least, that companies are proposing now are more cost efficient to use, usually because they're smaller, say more decentralized systems and so forth, that don't require building aircraft carriers and so forth. So the two issues are related. We need additional money into the system. We need a new policy modification in order to make the fielding system work better, but we don't need an entirely new industrial policy to do this.
Great, thanks. Derek, anything to add here?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I see we have some questions. I'm not a defense procurement person by any stretch of the imagination. I can propose something that would make the defense challenge a lot easier, which is we protect our own intellectual property better. Amazingly enough, we could have a bill going through Congress where we spend more on basic research, good, and we don't protect it from the Chinese because people are mad that they can't do whatever they want if they get government money. Honestly, I don't know the reason. And I'm involved in the process, and I still don't know the reason. So step one, don't let the Chinese steal intellectual property at will. We can't stop all of it. They're not going to stop trying, but we can do a better job protecting ourselves, and we can punish Chinese entities, the responsible Chinese entities, not a shell company that they set up that is not responsible, but the responsible Chinese entities for doing so. And yes, that will, lead to retaliation against some American firms, which is why we don't do it. But if we want a less technologically capable Chinese military 5 or 10 years from now, one thing we can do that doesn't cost the US government a dime is just protect our own innovation.
That's great, thanks. So we're getting some really great questions from the audience here, and I want to go ahead and start getting to some of these. And Derek, I think we'll come right back to you with this first one, and then invite our other two panelists to jump in. So here's the question from our audience member: with the U.S. having about 4 times the military spending the Chinese have, how is China financing these larger military forces without the subsequent costs that the U.S. seems to absorb?
Well, I can say a general framing comment about this. I don't know how much detail I can get into. I don't agree with the premise that the U.S. actually spends 4 times as much as China. The Chinese don't report their military spending in a way that corresponds to ours. There's a lying issue in China too. I'm not talking about that necessarily. They just don't budget the same way we do. And, internal security forces have some external security capability. The Chinese spend an incredible amount on internal security forces. So I'm starting off with the premise that you shouldn't look at an appropriations bottom line in China versus the US and say, oh, okay, this is how much more the US is spending. They are facing these costs. We haven't noticed this yet because we haven't really until recently been focused on problems in the Chinese economy. But one of the things they're going to have to decide on in their priorities is, okay, if we want to build up the technological capability of the PLA, the plan, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, there are going to be some trade-offs in terms of their size. So I somewhat disagree with the question. I don't think the gap in spending is that big, but to the extent that there is a gap in spending, the Chinese are now facing quality, quantity trade-offs.
Great. Any other comments there?
Well, this is one of my favorite subjects. So yes, if I could just jump in quickly, although I'll try not to go too long because I really like this subject. Right. So we always, as General Votel, you can jump in on this. We play the away game. So it's significantly more expensive to get there, the tyranny of distance, and to project power. Right. So that's issue 1 when they're in the neighborhood and everything's cheaper because they're right there. Issue 2, though, of course, is what I was referencing earlier, which is we have a large defense budget in real terms. It's not large in terms of what we can afford to spend in terms of the size of our economy. It's not large in terms of our federal investments. It's only about 15% of total government spending, but it is large in real terms. And yet we have a professional force. And so just like any large private organization in America, the single largest item on the balance sheet is for people, for professionals, period, full stop. It's over half the defense budget. It's obscured the way that, appropriators sort of, and the budget books come over. It's not lined up that way. So it's not clearly obvious to a lot of people. For China, they underpay their people, right? They can compel service. And so you don't have to pay people when you're compelling them. And so basically what that means is one procurement dollar for China is like $5 for our investment equivalent. We'd have to spend 5 to match their 1. So, or turn the telescope the other way. For every defense dollar we're spending, there's 1 dime's worth in there for procurement, the purchasing of equipment and the things that help give us that credible combat power and deterrent posture, which we're lacking. So, we have our own structural imbalances in our defense spending, and the 2 countries don't spend their dollars the same way, and it's becoming sadly more evident.
Yeah, thanks. Great comment there, and I endorse your idea on this away game business here. I mean, just if you pick a country like Afghanistan, just getting to Afghanistan is an operation, and not even talking about what you actually are going to do on the ground once you get there. So that is a really, really significant factor. So let's have another question from the audience. And Anthony, I want to start with you on this one. So our listener writes, I'm curious what the lessons are for American business regarding managing, maintaining current and prospective business in China, as well as managing and maintaining our national supply chain, given the mass voluntary in quotes, business withdrawal from Russia that was precipitated by strategic competition with Russia.
Well, my lesson learned from that was that I suppose two, um, that American businesses can withdraw from a country if they want. If there is enough pressure, they'll do it. Um, there are ways around it that aren't going to sink their businesses. They can separate them out even when they don't sell them. They have write downs. Um, and that they can move their people out of the country, all of those things. Logistically, it's feasible. But the other takeaway for me was that um, um, that the amount of American investment in Russia is much, much smaller than it is in China. And even then, it took what might be, in effect, the most popular war, in most of our lifetimes, right? I mean, effectively, the entire American society agreed with Ukraine on this. It had a hero in Zelensky. It had total bipartisan political support, more or less. And even at the level of average everyday consumers, there was kind of a backing of Ukraine on, Reddit chat boards and things like this. So it took all of the most popular war, in decades to move out of it hasn't actually been every American company, but whatever it is, 90%, something like that, out of a country where we have relatively little investment. And more than that, relatively little upside. Like I don't think that it's growing. American business is growing that much in Russia. China, on the other hand, there is significantly more investment, and there's upside in that it's seen as continuing to grow. And it's not clear to me whether you know even a popular war, say in Taiwan, which I doubt would be as popular as this Ukraine one, because it would involve likely American troops, I assume, in some means, and doesn't have a charismatic leader in the way Zelensky has been. I'm a little pessimistic about this, that American companies would pull out without there effectively being a law or policy or regulatory change by the government, which would give these companies, would force them out and would give them the top cover they would need from their fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. I believe some CEOs would agree with pulling out, but they're, because it's such a big portion of these companies' businesses, they would need some top cover, and that would probably have to involve some form of policy. Just public sentiment, I suspect, doesn't get us there.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So I want to invite Derek and Mackenzie to comment on this.
I just want to make a quick comment because I know we have more questions. Taking off from what Anthony just said, which is right. If you're imagining 5 years from now, we could be in a conflict over Taiwan, and you're going to say, hey, I have to protect my shareholders. That's endogenous. You chose to get them into a situation where they need to be protected in that war. And I'm not saying companies should be able to look ahead 35 years and know exactly what's going to go on, but they're being told far and wide, and they have a concrete example in front of them in Ukraine, that your bottom line is threatened by Xi Jinping's behavior, by the possibility of a conflict over Taiwan, by increased Chinese aggressiveness in the area. You cannot, and Anthony's totally right about their fiduciary responsibilities, but to me, it is not a reasonable response in 2026 or 2027 to say, what can I do? I'm trapped. There's nothing I could have done to avoid this part. So now, as he suggested, now is when companies have to, I don't want to put words in his mouth, now is when companies have to act. And if we get to a point some years from now where companies say, I'm trapped because I have responsibility to my shareholders, the answer is you already blew your responsibility to your shareholders, and you're going to be forced by the government to lose some of that value because you didn't act in 2022 and 2023.
Thanks, Derek. Mackenzie, anything to add on that one? Okay, then I want to come to you with the next question here. So one of our listeners asks, how will China's no limit partnership with Russia affect our strategy towards Taiwan?
Well, the honest answer is we don't know yet. We don't know if Beijing is having buyer's remorse over that no limit statement, as in, no qualifications, we're here for you. But even not knowing, we can at least, I think we should be humble and not mirror imaging in what we think it could mean. Basically, so be more dour in our assessment about the possibilities here, that the two country leadership working together is probably just not good for us in a variety of ways. And I can't really think of any ways that it could be helpful to us if they partner up. Right. So I think a little humility is welcome, frankly, in defense planning and wargaming and thinking, as well as this not assuming that what we think Beijing should do, and therefore that's what it's going to be likely to do in the future, which is I've seen some of that coming out of defense leaders' statements and documents. For example, we'll be, based on our investments and things that we're doing, posture changes and some military construction, that sort of thing, will be more capable in 2027. So therefore, Beijing will be really nervous then. Well, that invites aggression before that time. If we're projecting weakness in the interim and saying, wait till we build up and get ready for the big one. If I'm Beijing, I'm reading that the opposite of the way American officials are intending it, to signal, continued deterrence. So those are my two big points that I'm not seeing out of Washington, but I would like to see more of.
Great, thanks. So several other interesting questions here from our from our listeners. I'm going to skipping around a little bit, but I want to make sure we get this one in. A listener writes, the panel is focused on the issues of Chinese expenditures, particularly in the area of defense. Could you comment on the Chinese ability to raise revenue in their own economy, i.e. the efficiency of the domestic taxation, which would facilitate funding their ongoing offensive capabilities?
I can start. Most Chinese revenue comes from firms. The Chinese economy is biased away from households and individuals towards firms. They tax the firms. The bulk of the tax revenue comes from the state sector. Now, if you're thinking about dynamic tax revenue, this doesn't seem like a great idea. China, the expansion in Chinese tax base has been from the private sector expansion, but they're still heavily reliant on large centrally controlled state-owned enterprises. The centrally controlled, not just provincial enterprises, just centrally controlled state enterprises provide about 1/3 of China. This depends on how you count it, but about 1/3 of Chinese revenue. Then you have provincial enterprises, then you have other companies, then you have individuals. So you can see the role the state plays. And the disadvantage of that is the state without private sector reform is not dynamic. That's what China faces now. The advantage is that if you hand a company a monopoly to as large an economy as China, or a regional monopoly, you get the north, these other people get the south. There's going to be a lot of revenue to tax. And they're not going to complain. They're not going to come to Beijing and lobby and say, give us a tax cut or we won't support you in the next election. Oh, wait, there isn't any next election. There isn't any legislation. So, if you're talking about, and maybe this dovetails with what Mackenzie was saying, if you're talking about fighting China in 2040, I think they're going to have a serious problem with their tax base supporting a very large advanced military. But they have an assured tax base in the short term because the revenue comes not primarily, but heavily from enterprises, which are in fact directly controlled by the government.
Thanks. Anybody else on this one? So let me ask one other question here. Maybe all of you can comment on this one. The listener writes, can the U.S. keep its openness to global competition and protect its national security from China? Do we risk losing the benefits of competitiveness by protecting ourselves from Chinese predatory practices? Anthony, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I think that if China played by the rules of trade and globalization that had been developed over the last, call it 20, 50, 70 years, and the US did, there wouldn't be a problem. I think that the problem is one that China uses IP theft and other illegal means to compete, and two, that it uses maybe not illegal, but counter to the intent of the policy means of subsidizing its companies and so forth for geopolitical competition. And if China kind of played by the rules, or even more closely to the rules, we would be in an okay situation. So I don't when I hear us talking about these policies and changes to them, I don't think that it is the U.S. closing anything down. It's just attempting to maneuver the system back to something that I think was more or less agreed upon by the other countries in the world when it came to trade, and to try to hold China back from what I think are illegal and or counter competitive uses of a system that was already in place.
Thanks. Mackenzie or Derek?
It's all you, Derek.
Okay. Look, I mean, there are certainly going to be costs if we partially decouple from China, say. If there weren't, we would have done it already. The human rights violations, the aggressiveness, we would have already done it. So there are going to be costs. There's no doubt about it. I think the benefits are clearly larger than the costs, even on the economic side. And I know that's going to be controversial. Obviously, the companies that are successful in China don't think that. But there are a whole bunch of companies that aren't successful in China, and some of them are dead because they were killed off by the Chinese fairly or unfairly. I'll go back to the 1990s. China wasn't important to us. It wasn't important to competitiveness. It wasn't important to the world economy. The world economy did really well. So did we. We have decades of opening the world economy and being globally competitive without China. And to put a fine point on it, corporate R&D spending was faster before China's WTO accession than it has been since. So when people say, oh, I can't innovate without China, I'm like, well, what you mean is your revenue and your stock price and your stock options would be worse without China. But you actually were more innovative before, which, as Anthony just pointed out, follows from the fact that the Chinese attack foreign innovators, right? Oh, great, an innovative foreign company. Let's rob them blind and drive them out of business. So of course they discourage innovation. But the answer is there are absolutely losses here, but we were fine before China's rise. Apple was not a $3 trillion, market cap company, but that is not the same thing as how the American and world economies are doing. And as Anthony said, when you have a large predator, you shouldn't expect the system to be better for the fact that that large predator is included.
Thanks. Hey, one last question here, maybe focusing in on our AEI colleagues on this one. A listener writes, how might the experience of arming Ukraine affect the future possible U.S. armament of Taiwan?
Great question, and a good one to wrap on. It's been fun to learn from you all. I think it's pretty simple. 3 things: do more, do it sooner, and do it faster. As in providing capabilities, training, whatever's required, logistics support. I mean, it's not just stuff, although stuff is obviously very important. The military construction, the posture changes, the buildup in other NATO countries, all the things that needed to happen. It's just the model. The one thing we did do right, I'll conclude on, was our pre-positioned equipment and stocks. Again, General Votel knows very well how important this is, but the services trained on these, they unpacked them, they tested them, they made sure things were recent, and they were able to fall in within a week and start using that when needed and called upon. That's the kind of effort we need to see at scale regarding Taiwan.
Thanks, Mackenzie, and thanks to all of you. I think we're closing in on our hour here this morning, so let me extend my sincere thanks to our panelists, Mackenzie, Derek, and Anthony, for joining us today. It's been a very fast but insightful 60 minutes. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this is an evolving and dynamic landscape. And hearing the real-time and candid views this morning has better prepared, I think, all of us as we return to our boardrooms and offices this afternoon and start looking towards the future. I hope that this is only the start of a great collaboration between our 2 organizations on this topic. Certainly, American business thinks about this all the time, and we want to be a platform for that advance. To our audience, thank you for spending time with us this morning, and thanks for your great questions. Really spot on. For more information on either organization, you can find us at aei.org and bens.org, bens.org, respectively. And on Twitter, at AEI and at bens/org. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.